You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 307 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. The story of the founding of the United States is a familiar one. It usually, although not always, begins with the founding of Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, describes the founding and development of 13 British North American colonies, discusses the growth of trade and periods of imperial warfare, and then delves into the imperial reforms and conflicts that caused colonists to respond with violent and vociferous protests during the 1760s and 1770s. From there, we know that the War for Independence began when shots were fired at Lexington Green in April 1775. In July 1776, the rebellious Americans declared their independence from Great Britain. And from that time until independence was secured with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Americans persevered through tough military and political situations to overcome all the odds stacked against them. Have you ever wondered where this familiar narrative came from and why it was developed? One historian who has wondered about the origins of this narrative is Michael Haddam. Michael is a historian of early America who has a research specialty in the age and memory of the American Revolution. And today he joins us so that we can investigate the creation of this grand narrative about the Revolution and the founding of the United States by sharing details from his book, Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution. So, during our investigation into this story, Michael reveals the idea that history broadly, and American history in particular, are constructions. How Americans who lived in revolutionary and post-revolutionary America viewed and related to the past and history, and how and why the United States' first historians used the events of the past to fashion a new history and history culture for their new nation. But first, have you subscribed to the Ben Franklin's World subscription program? The Ben Franklin's World subscription program is a program that helps support the production of this podcast. It's a program that helps the Omohundro Institute keep this podcast going. The digital audio team and I regularly invest 1 hour of labor into each minute you hear on this show. Plus, while consuming a podcast may be free, producing one is decidedly not free. In addition to all of the labor we put into the show, we also have base costs for hosting audio files, the software we use to record our guests and edit the show. Plus, every once in a while, we need to invest in new equipment, music, and sound effects to produce the show. The Ben Franklin's World subscription program is a way that you can help us support and cover these costs. And in exchange for your monthly or annual support, subscribers to the Ben Franklin's World subscription program receive ad-free versions of each new episode and monthly bonus episodes. To become a subscriber, visit benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. That's benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. All right, are you ready to investigate the role that history played in the American Revolution and the new United States? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is a historian of early America who works as an associate director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. His research interests are in the cultural memory of the American Revolution and in early America more broadly. He's just published his first book, Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Michael Haddam.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks for having me back.
I think it's been a while, Michael. I think if I can recall correctly, the last time we spoke with each other on this podcast was way back in episode 23, so almost 300 episodes ago, when we talked about the papers of Benjamin Franklin. And I think at the end of that conversation, if I remember correctly, you mentioned even way back then that you were working on a book that shows how Americans came to create the very idea of American history and how that creation of American history didn't really come from the 19th century as most historians have thought, but really it's a much earlier phenomenon that it was created during the American Revolution. So I can't help but think that that's a really good place for us to start. Could you tell us, what you mean by American history and in what ways history mattered during the American Revolution?
I often come now to often say, quote unquote, American history, because a major part of the book is to show that what we call American history or think of as American history is not some objective term or some neutral idea, but rather is something that was constructed. And that really matters for two reasons. One is because it played an important role in shaping the revolution, but two, because in a very real sense, when many Americans today think of American history, they're thinking of something that was created by choices made by the revolutionary generation. So, for example, it's really easy to think that, what we think of as American history began with the first settlement of the English colonies, and that it includes the colonial period of those 13 original colonies, followed by the revolution and so forth. But that wasn't some fait accompli, right? The chronological and geographical boundaries that the revolutionary generation put around quote unquote American history in the process of defining it in the first place has really shaped how we've thought about American history ever since, right? And if we think about an idea like vast early America, which is this sort of idea of expanding those boundaries, that's very much pushing back against the terms set by the revolutionary generation nearly 250 years ago. In what ways history mattered, I would say most generally, I think the book argues that history and historical memories played important roles in colonial politics and society, and that they helped to shape how colonists made sense of and reacted to the imperial crisis in the 1760s and 1770s. And then after the war, history and historical memories became even more important as tools to develop a new national identity and to establish a sense of cultural independence from Britain to go along with their political independence.
It's interesting that you mentioned that history is constructed, because I often like to say that the past happened, but history is made.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you would talk to us a bit about how you see history as something that is constructed and what the process is behind constructing history.
Right. So, in the context of the Revolutionary era, I think there's probably two main strands of the process. And the first is the one that I sort of mentioned already, which is, the process of defining, right? What is included in your history and what is not. And I mean that very broadly speaking, right? But the second part of the process really is the creation of specific narratives, or what I call in the book historical memory or a shared past. I sort of use those interchangeably. So once you have your boundaries set, right, then you can move on to creating specific narratives. Of course, these historical narratives or historical memories going back to the Revolutionary era have always been constructed with contemporary issues and agendas in mind. But it's also worth noting that that process of creating a narrative also involves a process of selection, right? What events get included, what events don't get included, what these historians in this era decided to include or not, and there are real ramifications for those decisions.
Now, aside from history and memory, one of the other concepts that you talk about in your book, Past and Prologue, is this idea of history culture. Could you tell us about history culture and how this idea is helpful and useful for us to know about and think about if we really want to better understand the American Revolution?
Yeah, so history culture is a concept that I use to sort of approach the book's topic, and it's sort of been used by some European scholars, mostly in anthropology, but I found it really helpful to actually apply it to the American context. And really what it is, it's just sort of a fancy academic way of saying that I took into account how the past was represented throughout the culture of the Revolutionary era. So the last burst of scholarship on this topic, on history in the 18th century, sort of came out around the bicentennial. And, that work really focused mostly on a few of just the most popular histories from the period. And so I wanted to get beyond that limited perspective and get a broader sense of how the society related to their past. And so I looked at how history was used and represented in political writings during the imperial crisis. And then after the war, when American sort of cultural production really exploded, I looked at how it was used in things like poetry and fiction and drama and art and almanacs and school books. I also sort of looked beyond books to see how it's represented in magazines and newspapers and broadsides. And sort of like the concept of print culture, I also went and looked at the relationships between the people who were producing all of this historical themed content in all of these genres and the institutions that they created at the time. And so I think that as a concept, it's really helpful because it allows us to sort of get beyond just a few historical works and to think more broadly about how Americans of the Revolutionary era understood and related to the past. And that's really important for understanding the revolution because how Americans understood and related to the past really changed in a variety of ways over the course of the era. And the book really tries to show these changes over time and how those changes in thinking about the past, both shaped and were shaped by the politics of the revolution.
It's just fascinating to think about history being used as a tool, not only to shape and create a shared culture, a history culture, if you will, but also in the ways that we think about the past. And I think this is something that can best be illustrated if we talk more specifically about the American Revolution and the early Republic. So at the outset of Past and Prologue, Michael's book, right in the introduction, Michael notes that one of the most important questions to answer about the American Revolution is how did the colonists go from thinking of themselves as British subjects to thinking of themselves as American citizens in less than 20 years? So, Michael, what is your answer to this most elemental question of the American Revolution, and what role did historical memory and history culture play in making this transition in thought possible?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating question, and it's one that has had, the answers change over time, right? So if we think back to the famous John Adams quote from the early 19th century, where he says that the war was no part of the revolution, right? Because the real revolution was the changes in the minds of the people. He's basically talking about at least the beginning of this transition in civic identity from British subject to American citizen, right? Now, for much of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, many historians thought that an American national identity had been developing throughout the colonial period. And because of that, it was already developed by the time of independence. But really recently, in recent years, many historians have pushed back against that idea and instead have argued that an American national identity really didn't start to emerge until after the war, which is to say that they see American national identity as basically a product of the early republic. And in my book, I'm trying to basically split the difference between those two extremes. And I'm arguing that a shared civic identity did begin to emerge in the 1760s and 1770s before independence because of the political crisis, and that continued after the war. How that transition happened in the book, I argue that history culture and changing historical memories played a really important role in the cultural part of this transition. So, for example, because of the actions of Parliament in the 1760s and 1770s, I argue that colonists began to think about the Glorious Revolution differently. And that's important because the Glorious Revolution really served as the foundation of British civic identity, which is really not wholly unlike, how the American Revolution has served as a foundation for American civic identity for a very long time. And when Parliament begins to pass all kinds of unprecedented legislation in this time, colonists start to think about this foundational event very differently. So what happens is basically their experiences during the crisis really call into question the meaning of an event that had been fundamental to their identity as subjects of, the most successful empire in the world. And if you stop and think about it, that's a very sort of psychologically discomforting experience to go through, right? And we have some contemporary analog to that right now in that, many Americans today are questioning the meaning of the American Revolution and the importance of its legacy and its place, sort of in our civic culture. So basically, these colonists, they came to see the Glorious Revolution not as having, restored some balance between king and parliament after the Stuart tyranny in the 17th century, but they instead came to see it as having sort of simply reversed the roles and created circumstances in which parliament could act arbitrarily and tyrannically, right? And ultimately, I'm making an argument in the first half of the book about the cultural origins of the revolution. I think, we've had ideological, we've had constitutional, economic approaches to trying to make sense of the origins and causes of the revolution, but we haven't really understood its cultural origins. I think that history culture is one of a number of cultural breaks that were occurring during the 1760s and 1770s that really caused Americans in different ways to start seeing themselves as, if not wholly American, then at least not as British as they thought they were, right? I mean, if we think about the political and economic issues were important, but colonists were never going to support independence in any large numbers until they could at least start to see themselves as not British. And so I argue that these cultural breaks help us to better understand how colonists went from being proud subjects, in 1763 to declaring independence, just 13 years later.
That's really interesting to think about. I've seen and read lots of works about the economic reasons, the political reasons, and the ideological reasons for the American Revolution. I've read lots of works that talk about the social reasons for the American Revolution. But there aren't many works that talk about the cultural reasons for the American Revolution. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think the works that we have about the cultural reasons of the revolution don't really talk about it in the way that you're suggesting.
Yeah. Part of that, it's pretty much a historiographical dilemma, right? Ever since 1960, there's been this idea that was put forward by the late John Murren, which he called the Anglicization thesis, which was basically the idea that over the course of the 18th century, colonists were becoming more British, right? Not less British. And, that idea was really sort of widely accepted and is still widely accepted in the profession. But to my mind, that idea makes it that much harder to explain the break of independence, right? So all of the work on the coming of the revolution that's come out since 1960 has basically taken that idea of the colonists becoming more British as a given. And so I try to really focus on trying to answer, if that's the case, then how does it fall apart? And I really think that thinking in more cultural terms, it holds out the possibility for finding answers that we just haven't found yet.
Now, you mentioned that part of the transition that colonists made from thinking of themselves as British subjects to thinking of themselves as American citizens came in the idea that Americans viewed the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and used that event to think of themselves as a little less British. So I wonder if you would tell us more about that. Would you remind us what the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was and why this was such an important event for Americans?
Yeah, so the Glorious Revolution of 1688 is what ended the reign of the Stuart monarchs in England over the course of the entire 17th century. And that had been a really tendentious time, right? In English history, you have the Civil Wars, you have the Commonwealth with Cromwell, you have the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II. And then, this all culminates towards the end of the century in the Glorious Revolution. And basically what happens is James II abdicates the throne when a faction in England invites William of Orange to come and take the throne. And basically the Glorious Revolution creates the constitutional monarchy in England, right? And really lays the foundation for Britain's success in the 18th century. So it's really seen by colonists and all Britons in the 18th century as this crucial turning point where England emerges out of the darkness of the reign of the Stuarts and becomes this more modern empire through things like the creation of the Board of Trade and the bolstering of the Navy and taking on a national debt. All those things are seen as a product of the Glorious Revolution. And the other important product of that is that, the balance of power is shifted away from the king toward parliament. And that develops into this idea that I talk about in the book, which is parliamentary supremacy, right? Which means that nothing can happen in England basically without going through parliament. It really gave parliament a wholly new and enlarged prerogative that it never had before. right? And that was all fine for colonists through the course of the first half of the 18th century when Parliament and the British government was not trying to intervene in colonial administration so heavily. But of course, after the 7 Years' War, Britain and the new king, George III, embark on this program of imperial reforms to try to rein in administration of this new and large empire that they have. And this is what starts colonists off to sort of start rethinking what the Glorious Revolution actually meant.
Yeah, I'd say that the Glorious Revolution definitely gave the colonists a sense of a British feeling, because you had this idea that the colonists had rights through the Declaration of Rights of 1689 and a new constitutional monarchy. Plus, there was this idea of a Protestant empire. And the Glorious Revolution is what instituted that Protestant empire by excluding all future Catholics from the English throne. When I think about this, I realize that all this is important for thinking about how British Americans came to view themselves as Britons. But I'm also curious about how British North Americans view their history. So I wonder if we could pick up our story at the 7 Years' War, which is where you left us off, in the 1760s, when British Americans really started to question the ideas of parliamentary supremacy and their status as Britons. Michael, how did British Americans view history by the 1760s, and how did their views of history sometimes clash with the views of the past that Britons in the United Kingdom had?
Yeah, so it's really easy to think that the way that we think about the past sort of as being linear and basically progressive is how it's always been. But that view of the past really only came about around the time of the Revolution, sort of as a product of the Enlightenment. Before that, there were two other views of how history worked that were prominent. The first was millennialism, which was sort of derived from the Book of Revelations. And the idea was that, when Christ returned, that he would establish this, 1,000-year reign of the saints on earth prior to the Last Judgment. And that's why it's called millennialism. And that perspective sort of, the popularity of it really kind of ebbed and flowed. It was popular at some times and less popular at others. It was more popular, say, during the Great Awakening in the 1740s. But the main idea there is that history was providential, right? It was directed and determined by God. And so people, looked for clues and debated about when Christ would return and when that would all start. But the most important view of history in the 18th century was the cyclical view of history. And John Adams once called this the creed of his whole life. And so the idea that societies and empires kind of like naturally rise and fall over time, sort of based in part on their virtue, right? In newer societies on the rise, people are hungry for success and wealth and power. And so they're very frugal and they put the community's interests above everything else. But once a society becomes powerful and wealthy, its citizens tend to become, profligate, lazy, effeminate even, and they start to care more about their own, self-interest than the community. And that leads to that society or empire's decline. And in the 1760s and 1770s, many Americans came to believe that, Britain was on the beginning of its downslide and that the actions of Parliament were part of the evidence of that. These ideas that the way that Parliament was working and the ministry was working was in some ways corrupt. And this all fed into these ideas that Britain was beginning its downward slide. And what's interesting is one of the ways that people in the 18th century thought that you could sort of stop or forestall temporarily this inevitable decline was by returning to what they called first principles. Now, for Britons, that meant the British Constitution, the Glorious Revolution. And if you think about it, that cultural inclination really is still very much with us. You can see it in sort of things like originalism or the Tea Party, right? Those are expressions of this idea of first principles. It's still very much part of our culture. And I want to say that the other important part of this cyclical idea was that there were three sort of pure forms of government, right? Monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And if you have just one of those and you sort of leave it to its own devices, that they're always going to devolve into their sort of, malignant forms. So monarchy becomes tyranny, right? Aristocracy becomes oligarchy, and democracy becomes anarchy. And the way that people in the 18th century understood to try to avoid that was to create a mixed government, right? Or one that incorporated some aspects of each of those three pure forms. Britons believed that the Glorious Revolution had done that. But obviously, Americans came to question whether that was the case. And you can see the importance of it in the Constitution and the eventual structure of the federal government.
That's really good to think about. How history was viewed differently back in the 17th and 18th centuries from how we view it today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also a good example of how each generation, even as far back as the 17th and 18th centuries, has viewed the past through different lenses, which have always been influenced by whatever the present day circumstances were at the time history was viewed.
I mean, they related to the past differently in the 18th century for a number of reasons. I mean, one is historical distance in the 18th century was much less than we might imagine. I mean, our sense of historical distance, which is basically like how far away a point in the past seems from you in the present, right? Historical distance in the 18th century was really truncated because if you think about it, the basic rhythms of people's daily lives weren't all that different for the 98% of people who lived on farms than their ancestors of hundreds of years earlier. And so that had a sort of effect, in a sense, compressing historical distance. So the past didn't really seem as far away to them as we might assume, because our sense of historical distance is really exaggerated, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries because of, technological developments and things like that. So part of it is that they had a much more intimate relationship to the past than we have today, but they also sort of viewed their present through the lens of the past because they lived in this common law culture that gave real legal weight to custom and precedent and tradition. That really permeates the colonial culture beyond just the law. So I call this idea in the book the authority of the past. And it's important because it's one of the cultural reasons that colonists expected that their relationship to Britain had been defined by the custom and precedent of the previous half century. And they could feel secure that that relationship wasn't going to suddenly change. And being able to feel that way allowed them to develop expectations, right, for the present and the future based on the past. So when Parliament starts to pass all kinds of new legislation, colonists say, wait a minute, you can't do that. You've never done that before. Calling something unconstitutional, that's really unintelligible to Britons because how could a law passed by Parliament be unconstitutional when they set the precedent by passing the law? But this created a real sense of anxiety on the part of many colonists. I mean, think about it. How can you plan for the future if all of a sudden Parliament was no longer bound by the precedent and the custom of the previous 50 years? It's almost like Parliament could do anything. You couldn't possibly predict what they could do. And there's something of an analog, a contemporary analog. Many Americans over the last 4 years experienced this sense of anxiety that comes when you have a government or political leaders who are willing to do things that previously were not done by custom, right? I would say this idea, this reverence for the past, I call it in the book the authority of the past. The reason that it becomes a problem is because colonists had inherited this idea, right, from their ancestors who came to the colonies in the 17th century when it had real cultural power in England. But by the 18th century, in England at least, it had lost much of that cultural power, right? To many Britons, that idea sort of seemed outdated or provincial. They just won the 7 Years' War, become the largest empire in the world. And to many Britons, it made perfect sense, if that meant that it would take some unprecedented laws to administer this new, larger empire. And so as the debates wore on over the course of the imperial crisis, this became, I argue, a really visible cultural difference between colonists and Britons that led to, what I was talking about before, which is this idea of starting to think, hey, maybe we're not as British as we thought we were.
Now, one aspect of Past and Prologue, your book, that I found really striking is that the colonists' relationship with British history really seemed to change between the years 1763 and 1767. And I wonder if you would provide us with an example of how the colonists' relationship to British history changed in just those 4 years.
Yeah. So if we think about, say, the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, right? Many patriots, based on, this cultural reverence for the authority of the past, argued that there was no precedent for Parliament to pass such a tax on the colonies. And so therefore Parliament couldn't do it. John Adams, in one of his writings in this period, he asks, sort of incredulously, where he says, are we not to prophesy the future by the experience of the past? Like, that's just common sense to him, right? But what I argue is really at stake in the conflict over the Stamp Act is the question of whether colonists had the same rights as native-born Britons. And that political question had a real cultural impact, because if the answer is no, then colonists are basically second-class citizens in the empire. And that really helps explain, I think, the virulent and violent response to the Stamp Act, as opposed to attributing it to a debate over, say, the specifics of political representation. But after 1767, the conflict really begins to turn less on the question of equal rights and more on the question of whether Parliament has any authority over the colonies at all. And this is when their ideas about the Glorious Revolution start to change, and when they start to make even more arguments based on the original colonial charters, because those charters, they argued, entitled them to all the same rights as Britons. But after 1767, they start to argue that those charters were with the king, not with Parliament, and that put them beyond the authority of Parliament, basically saying Parliament has no jurisdiction over the colonies because our charters were with the king. So that's another way. And the other, I think, really sort of big change that I saw that was somewhat surprising was that it was really only after 1772 or 1773 that we begin to see natural rights arguments really, take precedence over these historical arguments that colonists had been making. Those historical arguments that they made throughout the crisis basically had not been persuasive to Britons for the reasons that I talked about. So they basically adopt this natural rights rhetoric as a way of still arguing the same principles from before, but instead by now they're attributing them to natural law. So they sort of universalize those principles and detach them from the British past. So there comes this part in the crisis in just a few years before independence where they adopt these natural rights arguments in part because their historical arguments were being, less than effective.
As we've been talking about, and I think as we can see through some of Michael's examples, British Americans used history as a tool to better understand the imperial crisis and their fight for independence. Now, as Matt observes, the people who were living in Great Britain's 13 North American colonies, they came from all over Europe and Africa, and they lived amongst very diverse Native American peoples.
Mm-hmm.
So, Michael, Matt wonders what role the diverse ethnicities and cultural origins of early America's Africans, Europeans, and Native Americans, what role those diverse ethnicities and cultural origins played in forging a national identity that was distinct from a British identity?
Yeah, so that's a really fascinating and important question, right? So my book focuses on the creation of this national identity. And it is true that, the population of British North America in, say, the mid-18th century is incredibly diverse. There are colonists from all parts of Europe in the British American colonies. But what I found was, and there's a ton of room to do more work on this, but what I found was, that it's important to make this distinction between, say, ethnic and civic identity, right? So you could be ethnically Scotch-Irish or ethnically Irish or ethnically German or Dutch or whatever, and you could retain those ethnic identities for quite a long time in the colonies. But most of those groups adopt the British civic identity, which is to say that they're not mutually exclusive, this ethnic identity and this British civic identity. And part of the reason that they do that is because, yes, they're living in a British colony, but also because the British Empire is very successful. And the colonies over the course of the decades leading up to the revolution are very successful. So even if you're a colonist who, say, came over from somewhere in what would later become Germany or from Scotland or whatever, you still felt yourself in a civic sense now to be a subject of the British Empire. And in most cases, at least for European descended colonists, that was a good thing relative to where they had come from. So, you could maintain your ethnic identity while also still developing this new British civic identity.
And now that we've discussed a little bit about ethnic and civic identities, I think we should talk about national identity. So as Michael describes in his book, Past and Prologue, Americans didn't just use history to better understand the imperial crisis and to create a sense of unity around their fight for independence. Americans also used history and history culture to help forge and unite the new nation of the United States. So after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsors, we'll ask Michael how Americans used history and history culture to create a sense of common identity and common nationality as Americans. I think it's been really interesting to hear Michael tell us about how British Americans used history as a tool to help them wrap their minds around the imperial crisis, as a tool that they could use to frame and understand the events that were going on around them, and even as a tool that could help provide context for how they came to their present revolutionary situation. And this is why I think it's so fitting that one of our episode sponsors is BetterHelp. Because BetterHelp has lots of tools that we can use to better understand ourselves and what may be weighing on or troubling our minds. Now, if you're not familiar with BetterHelp, BetterHelp is an affordable professional counseling service done securely online. If something's interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals, BetterHelp can help you by assessing your needs and matching you with your own licensed professional therapist. And once you're matched, you can message your counselor at any time. And if you don't like your counselor for any reason, BetterHelp is committed to helping you find the right counselor free of charge. Now, BetterHelp's licensed professional counselors are people who specialize in many different areas. They can help you with depression, stress and anxiety, relationships, sleep, trauma, anger, family conflicts, and so much more. Plus, anything you share with your counselor is confidential. And have I mentioned how this service is really convenient because it's all done online? Start living a happier life today. As a listener, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting our sponsor at betterhelp.com/Ben Franklin. Join over 1 million people who have taken charge of their mental health. Again, visit BetterHelp, HELP.com/Ben Franklin. During the American Revolution and War for Independence, Americans worried about the security of the messages they sent through private messengers and the postal service. In fact, many of the founders had their messages intercepted by the British, including John Adams. In the summer of 1775, John Adams had 2 letters intercepted when the British captured the messenger he employed to carry those letters from Philadelphia to Massachusetts. Now, one of those letters was addressed to Massachusetts political leader James Warren, and that letter detailed Adams's thoughts on independence and his contempt for some of his fellow congressmen. Much to Adams's chagrin, the British printed those letters in the Massachusetts Gazette newspaper and in London newspapers, causing some embarrassment for Adams. Now today, most of us communicate with others via email, text, and other internet-based messenger services. How do we know that our electronic communications are not being intercepted by unwanted third parties? The truth is, we don't know. Unless, of course, we're using a secure VPN service like NordVPN. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. It's a service that protects your connection to the internet and your online privacy. NordVPN is a service that protects your online identity by hiding your IP address. Your IP address is that string of numbers that allows your device to communicate with the internet. And NordVPN hides your IP address so that you can use the internet securely and without fear that your electronic communications, your data, or your web browsing will be intercepted. NordVPN protects you from this kind of digital theft by encrypting your internet traffic. It makes it so third parties or your internet service provider can't see what you're doing online or who you're communicating with, which means your data and communications are secure and your internet service provider can't throttle your upload speeds when you connect to file sharing services or engage in virtual gaming. Everyone deserves a secure and unrestricted internet. NordVPN makes this idea a reality. To find out more about NordVPN, visit nordvpn.com/BFW. And when you visit nordvpn.com/BFW, NordVPN will offer you a substantial discount of 73% off a 2-year subscription, bringing the cost of your online security to $89 for 2 years. Protect your data and your identity. Visit nordvpn.com/BFW. Michael, how did Americans use history and history culture to create a sense of common identity and common nationality as Americans?
I mean, the importance of the past grows even more after the war. So in 1783, right, the war is over, independence is secured, and Americans basically had a new nation whose history went back only 7 years. So the question became sort of, how do you incorporate a dependent colonial past into the national history of a new independent republic, right? And part of the ways that they did that is centered around these two really key political issues after the war. And the first of those is the idea of unity between the people of the new states and the new states themselves in this new sort of confederal system. So there's this idea of unity, and then there's also this idea of needing to establish some sense of cultural independence to go along with their political independence. And so many people who, in the book, I call cultural nationalists, because they understood that as part of forging a new national identity, that the creation of a new national history could help address those issues of unity and independence. And so basically what we see after the war is historical cultural production, which is a sort of shorthand term that I use for any kind of cultural production that has historical themes or content. We see that really explode after the war, and not just in typical historical works. We see the use of historical themes and content really in all kinds of genres and forms. So we begin to see the first American poetry, fiction, and painting. And the national past, this idea of a national history, is really prominent in all of them. It's also in this period that we get the creation of the first historical institutions in the United States, right? The Massachusetts Historical Society in the 1790s, the creation of the first natural history museums. All of this starts to happen in this period, and all of it is part of this broader project of trying to create a sense of a national history that could also bolster the creation of a new national identity.
I'm really glad you brought up that first natural history museum, because I think when people think of history, they tend to think of historic sites, maybe some history museums, and history books.
Mm-hmm.
And what was really interesting about your book, Michael, Past and Prologue, is that you also delved into paintings, like those painted by John Trumbull that we can go into the United States Capitol building and see in the rotunda.
Yeah.
And you also talk about another project, which is this first natural history museum, which was actually founded by another painter, Charles Willson Peale. So, Michael, would you tell us how, for example, that Peale and his artwork and his first natural history museum fostered this sense of unity and cultural independence that you've been telling us about?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we think about John Trumbull, right, who we know him as the painter of those very popular paintings of scenes from the Revolution, he initially conceived the idea for that series of paintings in the 1780s with the notion that he could sell prints of them. And they didn't really sell especially well, but he says very plainly in the subscription notice that the paintings and the prints were intended to preserve the memory of this period of our country's glory, he wrote. And so those paintings are filled with messages to his audience in the 1780s and 1790s. And they were meant to elicit a sort of sense of national pride, right? And we actually have a letter from Abigail Adams where she describes seeing Trumbull's famous Bunker Hill painting for the first time. And she says, quote, "My whole frame contracted and my blood shivered and I felt a faintness at my heart," right? So you can imagine the impact that visuals like that of paintings or prints could have on people in a culture that did not really have a lot of visual content, relatively speaking. Charles Willson Peale is this interesting character he was a sort of well-known portrait painter. He'd made a living painting portraits of elites, basically, in the Chesapeake region before the war. But after the war in the 1780s, he became really interested in natural history. And he's not the only one. This is a big thing in the post-war period. But those two interests with painting and natural history really collided in his museum, the Peale Museum, which is really the first natural history museum in the United States. It was in Philadelphia. When he established it in the 1780s, it's basically in his home. He had a wing of his home dedicated to being his museum. And then later, when it got more successful, it actually moved to the top floor of the State House of Independence Hall. But basically, we have some paintings of what the museum looked like inside by Peale and his son. And the main room was called the Long Room. And in the book, I have an image of a painting of the Long Room. And what you can see is, specimens lined up along the walls. So various specimens of animals and flora and fauna that were indigenous to North America, right? Lining the walls. But then you can also see that on top, along the top of the walls, are these really ornately gold-framed portraits of Revolutionary War heroes. And most historians have assumed that the display was sort of inspired by, the science of the Enlightenment and the idea that, the pictures of the people were on top of the animals because that was how they stood in the natural world. But what Peale was really doing was creating this sort of visual connection, right, between the natural history of the continent and the history of the new nation and its revolutionary past. So in a sense, what he's doing is effectively nationalizing natural history or nationalizing the history of the land. And in the museum's catalog, he wrote explicitly that his goal was to promote, quote unquote, national happiness, right? So this also goes back to the idea of needing to establish some sense of cultural or historical independence from Britain, because you incorporate the history of the land itself into the history of the United States. And that gives you a way to sort of transcend, that previously dependent past and origins in the British Empire.
I do think we can see from the examples that we were just talking about how artists like John Trumbull and Charles Willson Peale in his museum helped the United States create a sense of unity, and not just a sense of cultural independence, but also historical independence from Great Britain as well. And now I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the other form of history making, which is the form that we find in history books.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was during the 1790s and early 1800s that we really begin to see not just the first national histories of the United States being published, but also a lot of histories about specific states and regions.
Yeah.
So, Michael, could you talk to us about how state and regional history culture played a role in the development of this new national history culture for the new United States?
Yeah. So there's sort of two questions, right? One has to do with these state and regional histories that are written, right? And I would say that really, I think the most common and defining feature of almost all of the state or regional histories that are written in the decades after the Revolution is the idea that they're part of a project of creating this national history. So the idea was that it's much easier to write a general history of the United States if histories have been written of the various states, because then they can be combined. And of course, in the 18th century, plagiarism is not a thing. So, in a lot of these general histories of the United States, they would just copy and paste large sections from these state and regional histories. And that was really not a problem at all. So really, the state and regional histories that are published, really, even though they're sort of localized in scope, their purpose still focuses on the creation of a national history. But the other question there is about the role that state or regional history cultures played. And that is a really interesting question. This is another question that there's still a lot of room for more work to be done. What I found was that the degree to which different states or regions had history cultures really differed greatly. So obviously, New England had a very strong and developed history culture by the 18th century, but that was much less the case in, say, New York or Virginia. Pennsylvania had something of a history culture that was sort of founded on the myths of, about William Penn and the colonies' origins as a place of religious toleration. But New York, for example, had very minimal history culture. There was only one history of New York written during the colonial period, and so it wasn't widely circulated. And when John Pintard, who was, the founder of the New York Historical Society, when he published a notice in the newspapers in New York in 1804, announcing that he was going to start this historical society, the notice asked anyone who had information about the colonial history of the colony to share it with them. So Pintard and the others who were trying to start this new historical society and who were clearly amongst the most historically minded people in the city, in the state, felt that they knew so little about it that they would put out this kind of, open call for historical information, right? It tells you just how much a sense that even the people who are interested in the past, how little they knew, at least in New York, and even in Virginia. There's really one main history written about the history of the colony of Virginia, and that's in the very early 18th century. And, I found a lot of interest among elites in Virginia after the Revolution in preserving and sharing the history of the state. But the vast majority of the population there was relatively less literate and less likely to have the kind of disposable income, that would allow them to pursue really deep knowledge of the past, like, say, in New England. And I want to say just quickly, that really raises the question of how much did people in the 18th century actually know about history, right? And I would say that, the amount that people knew about the past grew over time as, publishing and historical writing increased. But relatively speaking, their knowledge of historical specifics was really minimal, an inch deep and a mile wide, you might say. But colonists didn't need to know a lot of specifics about the Glorious Revolution, say, to know what it meant to them, right? Like early national Americans didn't need to know lots of specifics about the colonial past or even the American Revolution to know what it meant to them. And that might seem counterintuitive, but it's still very much the case today. Every year or two, we get these reports from organizations, that survey how much Americans know about the past, and it's always very shocking and discouraging to historians at just how little, your average typical American knows about American history. But today, it's still the case that even the people who say don't know a lot about the American Revolution and the specifics of it, they still know what it means to them or what they think it's supposed to mean to them. So it may be not as counterintuitive as it might appear.
Speaking of these early histories, Stessa wonders if and how the United States' early historians incorporated the struggles and compromises made around slavery in the first histories and historical memories of the new United States. So, Michael, would you tell us how the early United States' historians dealt with early America's long slave past and how these historians dealt with the debates that slavery caused in big events like the Constitutional Convention of 1787?
Yeah, so in a word, they didn't. This is a really short and unsatisfying answer, but slavery is most notable in these early histories of the United States for its absence. And not just in general histories of the United States, because in the late 18th or early 19th century, they might contain a mention about the first enslaved persons brought to Virginia, but then contain, nothing else about the development or practice of the institution or the lives of the enslaved persons. I'll give you a sort of sense of how extreme this absence was. In the early 19th century, John Daly Burke, who was an immigrant who had left Ireland after getting into some political trouble, and he spent some time in Boston as a playwright and some time in New York as publishing a newspaper. But by the early 19th century, he found himself in Virginia, and he was prevailed upon by some of the Virginia gentry to write the first state history of Virginia after the Revolution. And he did. He ultimately wrote a 3-volume history of Virginia, almost 1,000 pages. And you can count the mentions of slavery on one hand. So, this is the most developed slave society in North America. And in this 3-volume, 1,000-page history, it's barely even mentioned. That gives you a sense of the scope of its absence. And I would say, as for the Constitutional Convention, we need to remember that what happened in the convention was largely unknown in the 1780s, 1790s. It wasn't really known until the 1840s when James Madison's notes were first published. So it's really not until then that the importance of slavery in certain debates in the convention becomes public knowledge. And obviously abolitionists, used that knowledge in their critiques of both slavery and the Constitution. And then just in general histories, we only really begin to see slavery in histories of the United States in any kind of significant or notable way after the Civil War. And it's because it's after the Civil War that it became possible to talk about slavery in the nation's past as a sort of pretext for sort of self-congratulation, right, regarding the abolition of slavery during the Civil War.
Was the United States and its people unique in that they used history as a tool to create not just this shared past and unity, but also in a way that gave them a sense that they were culturally independent from other nations? Have any other nations used history in the same or similar fashion?
It seems to be universally the case, or relatively universally the case, if that's a thing. The sense of the past and the creation of narratives of the past is a central part of the creation of civic identity in the modern nation state. Now, we talked a little bit about British civic identity, and Britons used the past as an important part of their civic identity when it was an empire in the 18th century. They remembered the civil wars as a really bad time that they wanted to not remember, and as sort of example of, what you want to avoid, basically. And the Glorious Revolution served as this sort of, foundational moment for their civic identity. But it's really with the creation of the first modern nation states in the late 18th and then into the 19th century that it becomes an even more regularly important part of the construction of civic identity. And the United States is sort of unique in some sense in the fact that, if you compare the development of nationalism in the United States to nationalism in Europe, the United States was in a weird situation of having had their historical origins documented, right? So the origins of England or France or whatever were really lost to time, but that wasn't the case in the United States. And it wasn't the case for the later South American post-colonial nations, right, who were in a very much similar position as the United States, which is, not just about having to create a national identity out of scratch for a new nation, but also how do you do that, in this post-colonial context? That also is very different from how nationalism developed in Europe.
Do you think we Americans still use history as a way to unite our nation and fellow citizens? And if we do this, could you tell us about an example or two of the ways that we've done this in recent memory?
Do we do this? Yeah, I mean, in 1780s and 1790s, history in the United States is very political in the sense that many of the people writing the histories or history-related content are supporters of the new federal government, right? And in a sense, they're sort of federalists, I guess, by default. But their primary concern is to promote the nation, not the Federalist Party. But there's a real turn toward the partisan politicization of history after 1800. And so I would say, this period in the 1780s and 1790s is really a sort of window, a somewhat unique window in the context of the broader story of American history. But since 1800, because of that partisan politicization, American history, I think, is, more often served as a tool to stoke disunion and define competing groups in opposition to one another. The most clear attempts to use history to bring the entire nation together rather than one part of it or one party, I think, are probably most prominent in our sort of biggest commemorations. So for the revolution, that means the anniversaries in 1826, 1876, 1926, and then, of course, the bicentennial. But I'm currently working on a book that explores the conflicts that were embedded in and created by those commemorations. So I would say that, more often than not, history is used more to unite members of a specific party or community than the nation as a whole. And there's really no shortage of examples of that just in the last year or so. If you think about like the 1619 Project, the 1776 Commission and Report, fighting over the meaning of the revolution and over American history generally is a really long-standing part of our political culture.
Well, we should jump into the time warp now. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Michael, in your opinion, what might have happened if most of the earliest historians of the United States had hailed from Pennsylvania or Virginia instead of from New England? What might the early American historical memory have looked like?
So this is a really fascinating counterfactual, right? It is the case that these earliest histories of the United States were highly New England centric. And a big part of that is because New England had this more developed history culture than the other states and regions, as I sort of talked about a little bit earlier. But as I've been thinking about this question, I actually wonder if there would have been a major difference. New England historians were prominent, but so was New England history, right? In the sense that it had been the best preserved amongst all the states and regions. I have this letter from David Ramsay to Jeremy Belknap, both of who were very popular historians in the 1780s and 1790s, in which Ramsay laments that the other colonies did not take as much care as the New England colonies to preserve their history and their historical sources and to produce historical writing. But Ramsay was born in Pennsylvania. He was educated in New Jersey and lived most of his life in South Carolina. And his histories are just as New England centric as any of the New England writers for that reason, right? So I think that for American history or an American historical memory to have turned out differently would more have required differences in the source base and the history of preservation than of the historians themselves.
What are you working on now, Michael? Are you still researching history culture in the early United States?
So I am currently working on a second book project, which is about the history of the memory of the revolution throughout American history. So basically starting with the revolutionary generation in the 1780s and 1790s and going all the way through to the 2010s, basically. So it's a survey of basically how we have remembered the American Revolution, how that's changed over time, and most importantly, how in each of these periods that the book covers, there have been competing historical memories of the revolution and competing ideas about the meaning of the legacy of the revolution and who could claim that legacy. And so my book project, which is tentatively titled The Memory of 76, is really focused on conflicts in how we've basically remembered the revolution, how we've sort of fought over the revolution going back to basically as soon as the revolution was over. And, I think that with the 250th anniversary coming up, that it's a real opportune time to look back and think about how we have thought about the revolution, how that's changed over time, and how it's always been a sort of point of conflict within our political culture.
I really like that title, The Memory of 76. It's not only catchy, but it also works for not only 1776, but for each centennial celebration and anniversary that has happened after that year.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we'd like to ask you more questions about history culture, the American Revolution, and the ways that early Americans have used history to remember the revolution, where's the best place we can get in contact with you?
My website is mdhaddam.com. So you can find more information about my work and the book there and various events that I'm doing about the book. I also produce a podcast called The GentoCast, which you can find at thegentocast.com. And, you can always email me. My email is mdhaddam@gmail.com, and I'm happy to receive emails from people with questions or comments regarding the book or this episode.
Michael Haddam, thank you so much for joining us again and for taking us through the uses of history and what would become the early United States.
Thank you for having me.
When Americans sought independence from Great Britain, they sought not only a political independence, but a cultural independence as well. To achieve these goals, the founding generation of the United States not only had to secure a permanent political break with Great Britain, they also had to create a new political entity, the United States, and create a new culture to which all Americans could belong. In a country filled with many different ethnicities and cultures, creating a new national culture proved to be a tall order. So where did the former British colonists begin? How did they work to create a new American identity for citizens of the new United States? One cornerstone of culture is history. And as Michael Haddam revealed, the United States was in a unique position in that, unlike England or France, the historical origins of the new United States were documented. So the earliest historians of the United States, men and women like William Gordon, David Ramsay, and Mercy Otis Warren, set about the task of contacting their friends and acquaintances. Men like George Washington, John Adams, and others, who had occupied starring roles in the Revolution, the Constitutional Convention, and the early days of the United States' federal government. These historians reached out to gather the documentation these American founders had, so that they could use these documents to craft the first histories of the United States. Of course, as Michael also mentioned, writing and crafting these first histories of the United States proved to be a team effort. Women and men like Jeremy Belknap set to work documenting the histories of particular states and regions. Artists like John Trumbull and Charles Wilson Peale offered visual representations that glorified what they saw as pivotal founding moments and founding people. And museums like the Peale Museum allowed Americans to get a sense of their place in the natural and national order of the world. The creation of a new national narrative in history culture played a big role in helping the disparate peoples of the United States' citizenry unite together behind a common idea of their nation's past. This common idea, this shared history, allowed the United States' resident English, German, French, African, and other ethnic populations to continue to celebrate their ethnic identities, while also uniting them into a new cultural identity, which we know today as American. So while distinct ethnicities continued and continue to exist in the United States, these identities often contain a distinctly American component. So where did this familiar narrative of the United States' founding come from, and why was it developed? It came from a need to unite the American populace into one people, who could and would support a new nation. The best way early Americans found to unite the new United States' population together was to create a shared sense of the past, a shared history that reflected how they came together, worked together, and persevered together to create an independent nation. You'll find more information about Michael, his book, Past and Prologue, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/307. Please help support Ben Franklin's World by becoming a subscriber to the Ben Franklin's World subscription program. To join and learn more, visit benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, have you seen or heard of any other instances where we Americans are still using history as a way to create unity, or perhaps even disunity, among its citizens? I'd love to know what you've come across, so please tell me. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.